All right, let's go ahead and get started for this evening. Welcome, everyone. My name is Andrew Felton. I work with the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District, and I'm joined tonight by Laura Allen with Greywater Action. Hey, Laura, how are you?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So tonight's presentation is on Introduction to Greywater. So we'll be talking a little bit about greywater systems, how you can install them within your spaces, as well as any other permitting and other regulations that you can look into if you're interested.
So it looks like we might have lost Andrew. Can you guys hear me okay?
Oh, sorry about that, everyone. I lost it there. So sorry that I am back now. Okay, so where was I? So yes, so we will be following up, sending a follow-up email to you all that will contain the recording of tonight's webinar, as well as any resources that you might have that we might discuss. At the very end of the presentation tonight, there will be a little pop-up that will have a survey. If you wouldn't mind taking a couple of minutes to fill that out, it is a great help in helping us develop these workshops and these webinars. So just to go over the format, I will be doing a brief introduction to the SWCD, the Soil and Water Conservation District. I'll hand it over to Laura for tonight's presentation, and then at the very end, we'll have a few minutes for a Q&A. At the very bottom of your screen, you will see a little Q&A section. If you have any questions along the way, please feel free to go ahead and put those into that chat box, and we can touch base with them at the end of the presentation tonight. So just to quickly talk about the Soil and Water Conservation District. As I mentioned, I work for Tualatin SWCD. We are one of the 45 SWCDs in Oregon. Our service area is Washington County, which is just west of Portland. If you're not in Washington County, that's quite all right. You're more than welcome to be here today. I do want to encourage all of you, though, to take a look to see what Soil and Water Conservation District or what conservation district might be in your area, because many of them have resources and programs like we do that can help you implement many of the same things that we like to help our community with. Now, we as a district are a non-regulatory agency, so we don't assess fines. We're just here to help folks. And what we really pride ourselves is we help our communities implement natural or conservation actions to help preserve our natural resources like soil, water, air, you name it. And we do that through three ways. We do that through technical assistance, so we offer advice. We do site visits. If you live in Washington County, we're more than happy to come out to your site and walk your property or your space with you and talk about some of the things you might be able to do. We do also do that through financial assistance. We offer grants as well as direct payments for qualifying projects. And we also do that through education, and that's through events just like tonight. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Laura for tonight's presentation. And I will be monitoring the chat. So if anything does come up, please feel free to reach on out and I can assist as needed. Take it away, Laura.
Thanks, Andrew. So I'm going to share my screen to get started. And let me know if you can all see this. So this is an introduction to Greywater, but I also like to call it Going Green with Greywater. We're going to talk about how you can water your landscape with recycled household water. Thank you all for being here. It's really nice to see so many people interested in this topic. It's very timely in the West, in Oregon, all around. We're having droughts and water shortages, and this is something really practical and simple that we can do in our homes, or it can be simple. It's not always. So we use a lot of water in our landscapes. We use about 50% outside for plants. And of course that number varies, but it's a big chunk of our water goes outside, and our plants don't need clean drinking water. They can be very happy and thrive with a different quality of water. And that's where Greywater comes in. So Greywater is water that you already used once in your home. It's from your washing machines. It's from your baths and your showers and your sinks. And just to kind of orient you to thinking about, is Greywater going to work for you? It's a tool in the toolbox, so it's not going to necessarily be the right thing for everybody in every situation. But if you're concerned about the water crisis and you want to save water, Greywater is something, it's a new source of water that's typically under or unutilized in a home. So it can really help with acute crises and also long-term droughts or shortages. And if you want a lush landscape in your drought-prone climate, it can be a great option. Any one of us living in a Mediterranean climate, we have drought just built into our summers. It doesn't rain during the warmest part of the year. During the growing season, we typically get very little rain at all. And with climate change, that's going to be exacerbated. And so Greywater can really help with that because it's a source of irrigation. If you can be mindful about what goes down your drain, Greywater can be really good for you. It is not going to be the right choice for people that don't want to think about products, don't want to think about, what they're putting down the drain. It's definitely, you need to be mindful and you need some education about what kind of products to use so your plants can be healthy and happy. Doesn't have to be hard to find these, and I'll talk more in a little bit about where to find these products, but you do need to be mindful and think about it. And you can always turn your system off if you need to use something that's not going to be good for your plants. And if you want to save time and money by learning what is the best system for your situation, Greywater can be a good option. Greywater systems are not one size fit all. They're not like something you buy in a box and you just install without thinking about all the nuances about your home. They're very site specific. It doesn't mean they're complicated, but it means that they're different than other types of conservation techniques that you might use, like switching out your toilet. That's really straightforward. You get a toilet that when you flush it, it uses less water. All you do is remove the old toilet, put in the new one, you're saving water. Greywater is different. So you need to learn a little bit more to make sure you're choosing the right thing for your situation. And if you're interested, you're in a good place because you're at an introductory Greywater workshop. And so there's two main ways to use Greywater. The first one is for outdoor irrigation. That's what I'm going to focus this talk on. The second way is also for toilet flushing. It's common sense that we don't need to flush our toilets with potable drinking water, but in practice, to get Greywater to be a good enough quality to come into the home, sit in your tank, not smell, not cause leaking of your toilet flushing mechanisms, to get all that to work well, it has to be a pretty sophisticated system and more complicated, more costly, more things to go wrong. So typically Greywater to toilets is a good option in bigger buildings where there's a lot more water, a bigger system, a maintenance person on site who takes care of all of the operations of the building. That's when it can work well. In a single family home, it's typically, I don't want to say never, but it's almost probably never going to be the right choice or the best choice for the situation. Rainwater to toilets, that's a different story, and that can be a great option. So if you want to look into your toilets and flush them with not tap water, you can look into a rainwater system. And if anyone has questions about this, we can talk more at the end, but for the rest of the presentation, I'm just going to be focusing on the outdoor irrigation. And so simple Greywater systems, these are systems that are typically more affordable, less maintenance, work for more people in more places, and they're really good if you're targeting your larger plants. They're great to irrigate your trees. Fruit trees are always nice because then you get fruit. Shade trees are nice because they can shade your home, provide habitat. There's lots of benefits to trees. They typically need a lot of water compared to smaller plants. Simple systems are great for bushes, vines. They can also work for your larger annuals and your larger perennials. They're not going to be good for other types of landscapes like a lawn. They're not suitable, or a lot of small plants. It is possible to irrigate these type of plants with Greywater, but it requires a more complex type of system. Sprinklers are never going to be allowed. You cannot sprinkle Greywater, so it's always going to be a subsurface irrigation. And I'll touch on just briefly a more complicated or complex type of system in a little bit, but I'm really going to be focusing on the simple systems for most of the talk. And so with any system, totally simple to the most sophisticated gray water system you could find, what you put down the drain is going to end up into your landscape. Even systems that filter gray water, they're not filtering out salt or boron or any chemicals that might go down the drain. So no matter what type of gray water system you're using, if it's going to your plants, you want to make sure you're using what I call plant-friendly products. So these products don't contain very much salt, they don't contain boron, and they don't contain chlorine. So if you imagine laundry or options for laundry, there are boxes of powdered laundry detergent that all that white powder is totally high in salt. So powdered laundry detergent is never going to be plant friendly. So you cannot use powdered laundry detergent over the long term. If you did once or twice, not a big deal, but over time, the salt could build up in your soil and harm your plants. The same with boron. Boron is also called borax. It's non-toxic to people and aquatic organisms. So it's in a lot of ecological products, but it's a plant mycotoxin. So if it builds up to certain levels in the soil, it can be toxic to the plants. So you don't want to use that over the long term in your landscapes. Same with chlorine bleach. And so you can always turn off your system if you occasionally need to use something that is salty, full of boron or chlorine bleach. But if you want to use your system for irrigation, you need to choose a product that doesn't have these very much of these compounds. There's a lot of examples. Most major grocery store will carry some product. Ecos is one that's pretty easy to find typically, and there's more. Showers, it's usually less of a concern in the shower because we usually don't use like a powdered shampoo or conditioner. And so shower products are typically pretty much fine for your plants. Cleaners is what you need to watch out for in the shower. So you don't want to use like heavy salt or really harsh cleaners. You can shut off your system, or you could use like a vinegar cleaner or something that's more going to be friendlier to your plants. And lastly, you don't want to use sodium-based water softened water. So if you have a water softener and it's sodium-based, that won't be suitable. Some people can switch to potassium, or there's also salt-free water softeners, which would be a whole other kind of system, but they are out there and that's suitable for gray water. So I'm going to talk about some safety considerations. Gray water is really different. For most of us, when we go outside and have a hose, it's connected to the water system that is the same water coming out of our shower, that's coming out of our sink that we might put a glass under and drink. Gray water is not potable. And so it requires just a little bit of a mind shift to make sure that we are treating it accordingly, making sure people don't have a lot of contact with it, making sure it's staying on the property and not entering a waterway. So these are just some basic considerations. These are also code requirements. Gray water should not pool up. We don't want to have puddles of it, ponds of it. That would be a place for kids to access it. Also vectors like mosquitoes could breed in that. We don't want our gray water system to cause any other problems. So no puddles of gray water. We also don't want people to have direct contact. When you're doing maintenance, you're going to put on your gloves. You're going to be, aware of what you're doing. You'll wash your hands afterwards. So that is fine. But in general, if people come to your yard, they should not be contacting your gray water. Your gray water is soaking down in the ground, and above the ground is free of gray water. And so the next safety consideration is gray water. It contains nutrients. Putting nutrients into your garden, that's called fertilizer. That is helpful. But if nutrients are getting into our waterways, that's pollution. That's nutrient pollution. It causes algae to grow. It takes oxygen away from the water source, and it's very harmful to the living things. And so gray water needs to stay on our property. It needs to soak into the ground. It should never run off. It should never enter a storm drain or be too close to a creek or a river. In the code, there are setback requirements that require the irrigation part to be a certain distance away from these waterways, and that prevents potential gray water from getting into a waterway. So you want to be mindful, especially if you're near a creek or you have a drinking water well, or you're near a river or a storm drain. You'll just want to make sure you're far enough away that you don't cause any unintended problems. And lastly, gray water it's not potable. It could have germs in it. So we don't want people to ingest it directly, and therefore you're not allowed to irrigate root vegetables with gray water. You can water a fruit tree because the food's above the ground, the water's below the ground, but you can't water a carrot. So now I'm going to talk about some kind of basic components of the systems that are really important. The first one is mulch. You probably have all seen mulch, wood chips. It's called arbor mulch or playground mulch. It's just chunky wood chips. And we use it a lot in landscapes for preventing evaporation and preventing weeds. In Greywater, we actually use it as the filter. So we put the Greywater through the mulch, through the wood chips. It filters it, it catches the lint and the debris. It also absorbs the Greywater, and then it allows it to soak into the soil. It provides surge capacity, so there's a lot of air spaces in that mulch, so it can soak up a lot of water, and then over time, it will soak down into the soil. On the right side of this image, you'll see what's called a mulch basin. So basically, it's a shallow basin. In this picture, there's a newly planted peach tree. It's very small. The basin's near to the tree. It's usually in what we call the drip line, kind of the edge of the branches. So if you have a big tree, the basin's going to be much farther away than a very small tree. We remove some soil, we fill it with the wood chips, and that is where the Greywater goes. So the Greywater is filtered, it flows through that basin on the bottom and irrigates a larger portion of the root zone of that plant. We also use what's called a diverter valve. So this is a valve that's in the system, and it allows us to control the Greywater. It can either flow to the landscape to irrigate, or it can go to the sewer or septic. So basically wherever it's going now, before you put in a Greywater system, your valve allows you to redirect the flow. Maybe you want to use bleach, or maybe you're dyeing your hair, or maybe you have poopy diapers, or maybe it's raining a lot and there's a giant puddle in your yard. Those are times you don't want to send Greywater out to the landscape. So you just turn the handle of the valve or flip a switch. These valves can also be controlled electronically. And now the water's going back to the sewer or the septic. So freezing climates, can Greywater work in freezing climates? It can. There's definitely some considerations if you're in a freezing climate, making sure that you don't have standing water in your pipes, that the water's all flowing down. People typically will turn off the systems in the winter because there's no irrigation need. But if you're thinking about Greywater, maybe for a cabin or for some application where you might need to use it in the winter, it definitely can work. Don't want to go too much into detail because most people in cities are going to be just switching it back to the sewer or their septic for the duration of the winter. And greenhouses can be another great option. In Oregon, the irrigation season is shorter than drier places like parts of California. And so greenhouses can be a way to use the water for more of the season. Actually, I live in Eugene and I have a big greenhouse outside. It's not this style in the image. It's a separate, just outdoor kind of hoop house greenhouse. And we have a lot of Greywater going into there because we can use it for longer in the season. When the other plants that's receiving Greywater, like all my fruit trees and berries and bigger plants, they don't need as much water as it starts to rain, but the greenhouse can still use Greywater for a longer portion because the plants are still active. And so I'm going to touch on design tonight because I really want to encourage you, if you're here because you want to save water and you want to use Greywater because you're trying to do your part, or maybe you're on a well and you really need to cut back because you're facing limitations, or if you're on a bigger watershed, you want to do your part to help protect natural waterways, we need to think about our design so we can save water. Just Greywater by itself doesn't inherently mean you're going to see any water savings. It's not like switching out a toilet. A Greywater system needs a proper design. You need to replace potable irrigation water with Greywater and remove the previous irrigation, shut it off, cap off sprinkler heads, whatever you did before, and now you can see savings. I want to show you this picture because it's a great example of what not to do. This is actually in Southern California, so that lawn is only green because it's irrigated with sprinklers. These people had a lawn irrigated with sprinklers. They wanted Greywater, they wanted fruit trees. So they planted their new fruit trees in the middle of their lawn. They built a technically fine system, nothing's wrong with it. They used all the right parts and it all flows out properly, but their trees are in the middle of their lawn. And so they continue to sprinkle their lawn and they watered their trees with Greywater. So all they did was double water these trees. They're not going to see an ounce of water savings or a drop of water savings. Instead, let's say they weren't ready to remove their lawn completely. They still wanted some lawn. They could have decided to take a portion of the lawn and turn that into like a small fruit tree area. in that area, turn off the sprinklers or whatever the irrigation system was, turn it off. And now that area is growing trees and they're being irrigated by Greywater. So they're going to see a savings of whatever percent of their irrigation that they just replaced with Greywater. So when you're thinking about Greywater, think about how can you replace existing irrigation? Or if you haven't planted yet, maybe you're designing a landscape, think about how can you create zones of Greywater that don't need any irrigation, and then your other part of your landscape, just try to be as water savings as you can with low water use plants, or maybe look at rainwater or other sources of irrigation water. Okay, so I'm going to talk about successful Greywater system design. I'm going to go over some parts to the design. And again, this is an intro, so I'm sure this is bringing up a lot of questions, and we'll have some time at the end. And I'm also going to give you resources. So if you're really ready to go and learn more, I'll give you places that you can go and get a lot more info, because there's a lot of pieces involved to have a successful Greywater system design. The first step is you want to understand your options. And I'm going to encourage you to choose systems. I'll call them tried and true systems. So they're systems that a lot of people have used. We really understand how they work, what they can do, what they can't do, and how much maintenance they take, so they are well functioning over time. So we'll talk about those in a sec. After you know the tried and true systems, think about which system will meet your needs. Sites are different. Some people need a pump, others don't. Some people can use gravity, others need just different contexts will require a different system. You also need to know how much do they cost? Are they within your budget? How complicated are they to install? Who is going to be putting this in? Is it you? Is it so you want to pick a system that's within your skill set? If you're hiring somebody, make sure you pick a system that there are experienced people in your area that can install it for you. And then lastly, the maintenance. You want to make sure your system doesn't require too much maintenance and it's feasible for you to do it. Some people choose to get a maintenance contract with their installer, and that's a great way to make sure the system is maintained over time. Other people do it themselves, and they require a system that's very low maintenance, like about once a year is going to be your lowest maintenance system. So I'm going to show you some of these tried and true systems. This one is called the laundry to landscape. This one is from the washing machine only. It doesn't change your plumbing because you're tapping into the Greywater right from the machine itself. So the machine has a pump in it, it pumps out the water. You take that washer discharge hose, connect it to that valve. One side of the valve goes back to the sewer or septic. When you've turned it in one valve, the handle one way, nothing has changed about your home. It's exactly the same. The other side of the valve now goes out to the new irrigation system that you have designed. So you're directing the water to your trees, your bushes, some of your larger plants. You're doing a match of how much Greywater you produce, how much irrigation need the plants have, and that's how you determine where to send that water. It's similar to a drip, except they're not emitters. We call them outlets. They're bigger openings, so the lint and debris, whatever's in that water, can pass through. It's filtered in the mulch in the landscape. So a lot of it can just decompose out there. And then once a year, you go out there and you will check on that basin and maintain it and make sure everything's flowing properly. This image is kind of a schematic because it's all buried, but just so you can see how the water flows from inside to out. The cost, it's a couple $100 in parts. A professional installation, it usually ranges from $700 if you have a very, very, very small, simple setup, maybe up to $2,500. It really depends. Sometimes your home might have stucco outside of the house, and that's harder to drill through. Maybe you have a sidewalk that you have to go underneath. Maybe you have long runs. Maybe you have to work in the crawl space. There's a lot of factors that might make the system take longer. And so there is a range of costs. Here's some pictures. Inside there is, on the left, you can see the washer hose goes right to that valve. The sewer connection is a standpipe behind the machine. Sometimes people have a utility sink. So maybe you have a sink near your machine, or maybe you have a standpipe. And then the Greywater side is on the right, and it's going through the crawl space and then out into the landscape. The second picture, this is a house that has an exterior wall. So you can see the Greywater pipe is going right through the wall, and now it's outside and goes to the landscape. When you're outside, the system looks similar to drip, but it's bigger, like I said before. The tubing is going to be buried, everything that will be buried in the end, but you can see in this image, this construction image, what it's looking like. You're trenching, you're sending this to your plants. This picture shows some newly planted fruit trees, and there's a mulch basin in front of them, and the gray water is going into that basin. Those black little circular containers, those are called irrigation valve boxes. And what they do is they create an airspace around where the gray water flows out. Because if you put gray water just right below ground or in the mulch, the roots will actually grow up your pipe because they'll want that water and they'll clog up your system. So this just creates air space around where the water actually literally comes out. It'll flow through the air, it'll land into the wood chips, be filtered, and then enter the soil where the roots can access it. And that's where you're going to check on your system once a year. So here's some finished pictures. Once you're done, there's not a lot to see. You'll see the covers of where the gray water comes out. A picture on the left, it's irrigating a row of fruit trees. The picture on the right, that's all just interspersed in those perennials. So you can't really see anything because the plants are covering up. But you'll have a little diagram so you'll know where they are. Maybe you'll just move some plants aside. It might be really easy, but in the image you see, you can't really tell where the water's going. But of course, you should know where it's going so you can take care of your system. If your washing machine's in a basement, you can't do this exact system I described. You can do an adaptation of it. You'll need a secondary pump, and you'll need to pump out the water. There's a little pump called a SaniFlow pump. It's made for that kind of basement washer application. And from that, you can then do the irrigation side, like the images you saw before. But I just want you to note that the laundry to landscape system I was showing you has limitations, one of them being it can't pump out of the basement. And there are more limitations that's kind of too many details to talk about in an introductory class, but they are important. So if you're going to build this or have someone else, you can learn about it from the resources I'll share. So the next kind of system is a gravity flow system. It's called a branch drain. And this system has no moving parts, nothing to break, no energy required to move the water. It's just flowing by gravity. To be able to do this, you have to be able to access your plumbing. So you have to get into the drainage plumbing of your home. You have to change your plumbing by putting in one of those diverter valves. It's a different kind, but it's the same concept. And then you flow the water out to your landscape. So your plants need to be lower than the gray water source. Like in this picture, the source is a shower and bath. You can see there's a way to access those pipes. The water's diverted, coming outside, and it's distributed into the landscape. This system uses rigid pipe, has to be sloped, so it's much more time consuming to install it, and it works much better for the larger plants because it's hard to distribute it to many locations since you're working with gravity. So it's really good for trees or maybe some bushes or possibly a clumping of other plants. It's a little less flexible than the laundry system, which is actually pumped out from the washer. So you can see the cost, it's typically a little bit more in parts, but it kind of depends on the size of your system. And the professional installation does cost more because one, you have to change your plumbing, which is a harder skill. And it takes a lot more time because you're sloping these pipes and trenching them. And it's much more time consuming. The previous system I didn't mention, but that's definitely a do-it-yourself project. If you do home improvement projects, you can totally install laundry to landscape yourself. This one, it can be a do-it-yourself project if you have modern plumbing, like plastic ABS pipe. That's not hard to put in the valve, but if you have an older home with older plumbing, if it's cast iron or metal or copper, that takes a lot more skill to successfully change that and install that valve. So you're most likely going to want a professional to put in that valve. And then the irrigation part, you can do yourself. It's quite simple, but it can be very labor intensive. And I'm not really talking about permit fees. We're going to get to a slide when we talk about permits, just to kind of keep that in mind. There are permit fees for all of these systems. So here's some pictures. There is the picture on the left. That's what diverting under the house looks like. It's coming from the fixture. It goes to that diverter valve, and then it can flow out to the landscape or to the sewer. Sometimes this can be really easy to access. Sometimes it's actually even in a wall of a home if you can have a little access hatch, or it could be in a basement or a garage, depending on how the house is built. But oftentimes it's in the crawl space and you actually have to crawl on your belly through the dirt to get to that valve. And if you're putting your valve in the crawl space, you want to have a motor. You don't want to have to crawl under the house every time you want to shut off your system. So it's pretty easy to install this motor. It's called an actuator. It just sticks onto the valve. It's low voltage, so you just plug into an outlet, existing outlet, so you don't need to do electrical work. You just need somewhere to plug it in, and you can control that with a switch from the home. And so here's some pictures. These pictures are from San Francisco. It's a very small yard. It's a 1-bedroom home that's their entire yard. It's kind of a good example of how one shower can irrigate one portion of the landscape. And in this particular home, it irrigated the entire yard. So their one shower irrigated everything because it was such a small yard. There are setbacks that you need to keep depending on the property line, the pipes going into the landscape, sloped, it's trenched, it's buried. This site had no existing landscaping, so that can be a big difference. If your house already has trees and bushes, it can be a lot more challenging to navigate through that, but this is a great kind of clean plate example. Picture on the right, you can see the pipe comes into that irrigation valve box. It's in the mulch basin. That basin will be filled up to the top and the plants are planted adjacent to it. This site has very sandy soil. It had sandy loam, which drained really quickly. So these basins are quite small. If you are in a site that has clay soils where water drains more slowly, your basins are going to be larger to accommodate the slower draining of the water. So just here's the finished system and then 1 year later. So now we'll get into systems where you have to have another pump in your system. Sometimes you have an upward sloping site, or you have to cross a large patio, or some way where you can't use gravity and the laundry system is not going to either be able to do it, or maybe you're wanting to use shower water, which doesn't have a pump inside it. So you can have a simple pumped gray water system. You still need to access the plumbing. You need to redirect the water into we call this a surge tank. So it's a small tank, usually about 30 to 50 gallons. We're not storing the water, we're just collecting enough of it to then be pumped out. There's a pump in the tank. It is an effluent pump. That's a dirty water pump. So it can pump out all the gunk and lint and debris, pump it right through the irrigation tubing, and then it goes out to 1/2-inch outlets in the landscape. So the irrigation landscape side is similar to that first washing machine system I showed you, but this is now connected to a pump. It's not connected to the washing machine. There's a lot of details around this, but this is the concept. So it's being pumped out. Filtration happens in the landscape in those mulch basins. Here's some pictures. You can see the size of the tank. The picture on the left, that's a basement. So they were able to access the plumbing and run that into the basement. The picture on the right, this is a tall crawl space. So they had to get a tank in there, bury it partially, and do all the plumbing under the house, and then send it out to the landscape. And then the last kind of system I'm going to talk about are pumped and filtered systems. Sometimes people think when they hear gray water, they think, oh, I need to have a filter. Gray water's dirty. I have to get out that dirt. Gray water is dirty, but your plants don't care about the dirty stuff. Your irrigation system might. So if you want to get dirty gray water through a drip emitter, those little teeny tiny holes, you definitely need to filter it. Once you're filtering gray water before you sending it through irrigation, now you have a maintenance issue. You have a filter that's designed to clog because it's catching all the debris. Once it clogs, there's nowhere for the water to go. If you don't adequately clean it out, your whole system will fail. Your pump will burn out. Not a good situation. Filters are the #1 source of failure in gray water systems because people don't maintain them properly. It's not really that fun to clean out a slimy gray water filter. So I want to encourage you, if you have trees, bushes, shrubs, anything that doesn't actually need drip irrigation, I encourage you to skip the filter, look at these other systems that I shared. Maybe your landscape is a lot of small plants spread out over a large area. You do need drip irrigation to spread the water out over that large area. So if you're in that situation, then you do want to look into a pumped and filtered system. But many people aren't. Many people have landscapes that are totally suitable for unfiltered pumped gray water or laundry gray water, laundry to landscape, or the gravity fed branch drain. So getting into the filter. So now let's say you identified that you do need a filter. You have the same kind of concept as before. You divert the water. It's going into this temporary tank. There's a pump in it. It's pumping it out through a filter that's catching all the debris, and then it goes out into a special drip system. This is not just a regular old drip, because even filtered gray water is dirtier than other sources of water. It will clog up regular irrigation components. So you need dirty water irrigation. It's made for usually septic effluent. It's available around. It's a little more expensive, specialized, but it definitely is out there and it works. It is designed for dirtier water. So you're going through this special drip system, and now you have a Greywater 2 drip irrigation system. Some of these systems require you or someone to physically clean out the filter, like the picture on the left. These ones are very prone to failure unless you get a maintenance contract with an installer and someone on a regular basis comes and cleans your filter. I, of course, tried out many kinds of Greywater systems, and when I had one that required me personally to clean out this filter on a regular basis, I said, oh, of course I'm going to do it. I love Greywater, it's my favorite thing. But did I clean that Greywater filter on a regular basis? I did not. And my whole system clogged up. The pump was running endlessly. Luckily, it didn't burn out because I noticed, but it almost did. It's just, we're humans, we forget, we get busy. So don't rely on you to clean a Greywater filter. That is my advice. If you have a maintenance contract, then you can rely on a manually cleaned Greywater filter and have a drip irrigation. What's better, though more expensive, is a Greywater system that automatically cleans out the filter. There are more sophisticated kinds, like I mentioned early on, that could do a lawn, like in this image. It's not your standard lawn, but it is Greywater irrigated lawn, large area with drip irrigation. These systems have a filter that automatically cleans itself every so often, and then you only have to do something once a year versus a manually cleaned filter where you have to clean it out every couple of months. So there's a few out there, and yeah, they cost more. And so I want to share one example of a great site that's using very simple Greywater plus more advanced systems based on need. This is Evergreen Lodge. It's in Yosemite. It's a resort, like you can, stay there. There's little cabins. It's very beautiful. It's a lovely place. And they recycle 1.8 million gallons per year of Greywater. They have 55 guest cabins, and these cabins are like little tiny houses. They're kind of two little bedrooms, separate, two different cabins connected to one house. So it's quite small. And around each one is a landscape that is irrigated with native plants, bushes, beautiful kind of natives from that area. And they have their simple gravity flow systems on all of those cabins. So like every single 55 cabins has its own small Greywater system watering its own small area, but altogether it's a huge system. But they're simple, each one, simple to maintain, simple to fix if anything goes wrong, each one of them. Then they have their commercial laundry, which has tons of laundry from the whole lodge. Plus they have staff dorms where all the staff lives and makes a lot of shower water. Those situations are not suitable for a simple system. They have way too much water. They need to really spread it out far. They need to pump it. They need to filter it. So they have these pumped and filtered systems that are working in combination with these simple systems. And they also operate in all 4 seasons. So in Yosemite, it gets quite cold. They have snow, and they operate all of these systems all year long. So we just did step 1. Step 1 is the longest. We understand our options. So once you understand that, now you want to go to your site, and now you want to take your knowing about these different systems and think about, well, how will this work on my site? So there's a couple of things to consider. One of them is your slope. So does your site go uphill? You might need a pump. Or does it go downhill? Then you definitely don't need a pump. Or is it flat? So your site will determine which of these systems may or may not work for you. Setbacks. So you need to be set back from creeks, drinking water wells, property lines. That might affect your design. Maybe you were thinking, oh, I'm going to water that area by the creek. But now you know I am not going to irrigate near the creek. I'm going to go to the other side of my house that's far away from the creek, for example. Soil type. I mentioned that before. Your soil type will determine how quickly or slowly water soaks down from your site. And it's not going to change how much water your plants need, but what it will change is how big of a basin you need to dig so you don't have puddles or runoff of gray water. Your basin needs to be big enough to soak up all the water that you're sending to it. So it's a sizing calculation that you do. It's quite simple, but you do need to know how much water and you do need to know your soil type. And then you need to know what plants are best suited for gray water. Any plants that like irrigation that are the size that's going to match your system. And you need to know how many of these plants can you irrigate. So that's a really important one because that's going to help you get the most savings possible out of your gray water. So you need to know how much gray water and then how much do your plants need, and then you match so you can irrigate as many plants as possible. And there's lots of resources that can help you do this. Lastly, you have to know what fixtures can you access. Not all homes, if they're already built, can access all of the gray water sources, or they can be maybe too expensive to get to them, but sometimes you can get everything. It just depends on your house. And also you want to consider your other reuse options. So maybe you also want to use rainwater. So if you're going to have a rainwater system, where's that going to go? So I don't want this to paralyze anyone with, oh no, I have to have this huge master plan for my whole site. You don't. But it's good to just take a few minutes and think and look around and think about, well, if I also want to do rainwater, where might I locate it? So you can best use all of these on-site waters to give the most benefit to your landscape. So after you've done all that, you get to choose a system that's going to meet your needs, thinking about what's going to work best for you. These were the ones we talked about that are typically the best options. And then you design your system. So there's the calculations I mentioned. There's a couple. They're quite simple, but you do need to know how to do them. And with resources, you can definitely do this or work with a professional. So how much gray water does your home produce? How much do your plants need? What regulations are in your area? And I'm going to talk about Oregon regulations in a sec, because that can impact your design. And then basic health and safety requirements. What should you understand so your system is safe? If you have a gravity flow gray water system like the branch drain or the longitudinal landscape, these systems are completely separate from other sources of irrigation. As long as you're keeping it below ground, you're following basic guidelines, there's really not a lot to go wrong. On the other hand, if you have a pumped gray water system and you've gone to one of the more complex systems where you have a filter that's automatically cleaned, some of these filters are backflushed with clean potable water. And so you have, with that type of system, a potential to have dirty gray water connecting into the same lines as clean drinking water. You never want dirty water to get into the drinking water line. So those systems require backflow prevention to make sure that can't happen. So they require more oversight. There's definitely more that could go wrong. And you can have a very well functioning, totally safe system, but you need to make sure that you are following all the guidelines. A complex system is not a system that you want to skirt around regulations or kind of ignore any health and safety considerations, because pressurized non-potable water could get in the wrong place and it could contaminate the drinking water supply, which is definitely not what we want to happen. So in Oregon, gray water didn't used to be legal. It started out being legal for indoor systems. And there was a while where it wasn't really possible to do a legal outdoor system, yet people were doing it because, it's kind of logical. People tend to use gray water all over for a variety of reasons, regardless of legality. But now it is legal. So you can get a permit. It's through the state. It's a Department of Environmental Quality permit. There have been some permits, but there haven't been a lot. And so it's a great time to go out there and work with you just have to work with the state. The person who runs the permit department at the state is very knowledgeable and supportive and helpful and can help you get a permit for your gray water system. And it's not too expensive either. So looking at this, you have to get your permit through the Department of Environmental Quality. It's a 3-tiered approach. So if you're a single family home and you're just using gray water for irrigation, you're in the simplest scenario and it's not too expensive and not too hard. If you're trying to get a permit for commercial or multifamily, or it's a lot of water, then of course there's going to be more oversight. But I'm assuming that most of you are in the single family home, you're just using it for irrigation. So that's a pretty doable permitting situation. So you get your permit through the state. It is mail in and mail application, like they don't actually come to your site. So I think they could, but they typically don't. And you may also need a plumbing permit. Let me kind of back up for a second. There's a couple of steps in your permit, and we have a website on greywateraction.org. There's an Oregon portion. So if you go to this URL, or if you just put Oregon in the search, you'll come up with this page, and we have examples, permits that have been filled out where you can really see what is required of you there. So you have your state permit. If you change your plumbing, you might need a plumbing permit, or you will need a plumbing permit, but the laundry system doesn't change your plumbing. So you don't need a plumbing permit if you're not changing your plumbing. Then you need to present a system plan, and we have examples of it that you can see and you can fill out and comply with. And then there's also an operation and maintenance manual. So you need to show them that you understand the maintenance and you know what to do. And so we have an example of that too, that you can see and you can download and adapt. So those are the regulations, and now you're ready to build your system. This is the fun part. So you want to assess your skill level and the skills required depending on what kind of system you are choosing, and you want to make a good match. Think about specialized parts. Some of these systems are mostly parts you can find in an irrigation store or a hardware store, but there's some parts like those diverter valves that you might need to order. So making sure you get them in time to build your system. And then making sure that if you're going to hire somebody, that you are prepared to work successfully with a contractor. Unfortunately, some tradespeople, plumbers in particular, who of course know how to move pipes and change your plumbing, they're often not really a good option for Greywater if they haven't specially trained to understand Greywater. There's been a long history of Greywater is sewage, we need to get rid of it, or we treat it like it's a septic system, it's just smaller. So people do kind of weird adaptations to a septic where it goes into a tank and then a leach line, and it's not really used for irrigation. So if you're trying to look for someone to hire and you're not finding someone really trained, I would encourage you to go to a landscape contractor, somebody who is focused on ecological landscaping, who is more able to kind of absorb the new information. It's definitely a shift in philosophy or a shift in training to see Greywater as a resource that can be used to irrigate. It's very different than how many tradespeople have been trained to think of Greywater. So if you can be very educated, understand what you want, know the system, and then find someone to work with, you can get a great Greywater system installed. But again, you might be told it's illegal. You can't do that. I can't do that. That's not possible. And those things are not true. Just people don't always know, or they might not want to do it. And it's easier to say that you can't do it than for them to say, I don't want to do it. I don't know why that, but I've heard lots of stories of people trying to get professional help and told misinformation that was discouraging. So just to end with resources, and then we'll do questions. Our website has a lot of information. We're doing online classes that are more in depth if you want to learn more. I wrote a book called Greywater Green Landscape. It's the image on in the picture. And that is a how-to book. So it'll walk you through the design plus the construction of a variety of types of systems and give you tips of where to go for parts and things like that. And then we have a lot of free resources. We have past webinars, articles, studies. We have Spanish language resources and Mandarin language resources too on our website. And we have a forum. So if you ever have questions, technical questions, you can always post them to our forum and you can get help there. So this is our online classes, but I'm gonna skip over that and end there to see if there's any questions.
Systems. I know I sure learned a lot with seeing all the different systems that you showed. So yes, we have quite a few questions. So I'm just going to kind of run through kind of a bunch of different ones here. So one of the questions was, why can't they use water that has been treated with salt?
Salt will, if it builds up in the soil, it inhibits the plant's ability to uptake water and nutrients. So salt buildup in the soil can be harmful to your plants. Great.
Thank you for that. Talking about professionals that might be available to install this system. This person has a background in landscaping and plumbing background and is interested in working in Greywater. Are there any extra permits that are required to work in this area?
There are, so no, the short answer is no. You have to follow standard legal practices around a business and what your contract allows you to do and what it doesn't. But for the residential Greywater, you just need to be a contractor. If the bigger systems, there are some requirements, which I don't know off the top of my head, but for putting in a residential Greywater system, you just need to comply with like contract law and basic business law. We have our class, this one, Greywater Design Mastery. This might be a class of interest to professionals because we go really step by step through the design process, and you get forms and ways to help design your system, really designed to help you go through that whole process, which you can use for your own home or for a client's home. So you might be interested in that, or just your own study.
Very good. Thank you. We've had a couple of questions talking about how do Greywater systems interact or interfere with septic tanks. Some are concerned about the worry of change of percent of black to Greywater. Can you talk a little bit about how those systems interact with one another?
Yes, that's a great question. I want to go back to the previous question.
Okay.
If you're going to be working on plumbing, you do need to have a plumbing license or be a general contractor and do 3 trades. But for most of the Greywater, which is the irrigation, then landscape contractor is fine. So there is a little nuances. I want to say that. So going to the septic question, that is an important question. So if the septic system is kind of a standard septic tank and leach field, when you remove the Greywater, what you're doing is you're increasing the retention time in the septic tank, which actually helps with treatment. So there's, so if your septic tank is properly functioning, if there's not like some other issue going on, if it's a properly functioning septic system, removing Greywater increases retention time in the tank. That actually can have a benefit to the treatment. And there are studies that show that. If it's an advanced septic system, advanced treatment system, those function very differently. And if by changing the ratio and the loading of that system, it could cause problems. So with that, you would want to talk to the designer and look at the new loading and how that impacts the advanced system. But if you're the tank in the leach field, kind of the conventional septic, you're removing Greywater is most likely going to improve the treatment of your system.
Very cool. Let's see. Another question that we have, I know you talked about wanting to have specialty soaps to use within Greywater systems. Why is that? What is it about those soaps that impact soil, plant life, animals, etc.?
Yeah, and it's not really specialty soaps. It's just you're wanting to avoid adding a lot of salt, adding boron, or chlorine bleach. These are things that can be harmful to the soil or the soil life. And so everything else is a kind of a non-issue to the plants.
Awesome, great. For a gravity-fed system, how much downgrade per foot would this person need, ideally?
It's a 1/4 inch per foot. That's the standard slope. You could go, if need arises, to an 1/8 inch per foot. That's also allowed, for drainage plumbing, but 1/4 inch per foot is typically what you're shooting for.
Very good. This person, their area has hard water. Is it likely that their city uses a water softener that contains harmful elements for their Greywater system?
I don't know. I only know about home scale softeners. I don't know anything about city level. But typically, if you have a water agency, then they provide water quality information publicly. So you probably could find out and see how salty it is.
It's great. I'll always go to the folks that manage it. That's always a good solution. Mm-hmm. So most of this person's water comes from the kitchen sink. Are there any special considerations outside of correct soap and no salt?
So kitchen sink water is gunkier, it's greasier, much more prone to clogging. It is allowed in Oregon. Some states don't even consider kitchen sink water Greywater, like California, though hopefully that'll change someday. It's I think a code issue, not a because clearly kitchen sink water is different than toilet, which some states put kitchen with the toilet and call them the same thing, but they're clearly different. In Oregon, kitchen water is gray water. You're not allowed to use a garbage disposal. I can't remember about the dishwasher, but I believe it might, if you're getting a permit, they might want you to have a grease trap. I don't actually know of any permitted kitchen sinks in Oregon. But in practice, the kitchen water is gunkier. And so definitely a branch drain. Don't try any type of filtration. That would just be a disaster. And then know that you'll probably have to maintain your basins 2 times a year instead of once a year for the other sources of water.
Great. All right, so I have a couple questions that are kind of similar, so I'm going to read both of them here. So this person may have missed it, but what happens to gray water if they don't recycle it, and why is it more sustainable to recycle gray water? And then this other question is about their current water district uses gray water to water their school fields, green belts, etc. They also have a rain barrel system. Why would a gray water system make sense in this case if their water district is already using it?
Yeah, those are great questions. So typically gray water from a home, if you're on a sewer, if you have a septic, it goes and soaks down into the ground on your property. So it does stay local. But if you're on a sewer system, it leaves your property, it goes with the black water, it mixes into all your neighbor, or the toilet water, it mixes into all your neighbors and all the businesses. And now it all goes to the wastewater treatment plant where it's cleaned, nutrients are removed, it's disinfected to kill germs, and then it's dumped out in the nearest waterway. It's usually a river or some kind of waterway nearby. So depending on where you live, you can find out where it goes. It takes a lot of energy to do all that. It takes energy to get it to your house, to clean it to drinking water quality. Then you use it. Now it goes to the sewer plant that takes a lot of energy to clean that water. Your gray water, like you have control over what goes in it, but once it's combined with everything else, now it's mixed in with pharmaceutical residue from toilets and industrial residue. There's a lot of things, they're called contaminants of emerging concern. They're things that are not good, but they're not regulated. So now all that's gotten out into the environment, which is not your fault or your gray water's fault, but now it just goes out with this huge flush of water, and it's typically not used. And it took a lot to get it to you and then away from you and cleaned up to be dumped. So if you're irrigating, you can bypass kind of that whole system, and you can save for your community scale, you can save money, you can save resources, because now you're keeping your gray water on site and irrigating and not using extra water. So that's the first answer. For people that have, for your municipality, they might clean the water. It's going to be treated sewage water. So it's all the water together. It's clean to irrigation quality. And now it's used on parks and, big areas. So it comes back in a purple pipe and it goes to irrigate. It's called recycled water. So that's more than gray water. It's actually cleaned, all the water, the combined wastewater. And that's good. It's reusing the water. But again, it takes a lot of resources, chemicals, energy, money to do that. So if you're going to be irrigating your own yard, you could save on the community scale by irrigating with your gray water. So I hope I answered that clearly.
I think so. Yeah, I think that made pretty good sense to me. And I'll also include, Laura, if you don't mind, I'll CC you on the follow-up email that I'll send to anyone. And if any clarifications are needed, is it okay if folks reach out to you as well?
Definitely.
Cool. So this person is wondering about mulch basins. Where can they find more information about mulch basins? And for example, how to design with typical dimensions.
The book Greywater Green Landscape, that has a lot of details of mulch basins. There is a free downloadable manual that you can get to on our website. It's actually through the San Francisco Water. It's like I was the main author on that, so it was a while ago, but it's still applicable and helpful, though it's geared to San Francisco. So the climate stuff is different, but it shows you how to dig a basin and all the basic stuff, and that's totally free. You can download it as a PDF. So those are 2 places to go.
Great. Is there any data on whether a gray water system affects the resale value of a home?
I don't know.
I wouldn't know either, but I figured it was a good one to ask. I'm sure as these systems become more prevalent, folks will be more familiar with them. So I would think, as this practice becomes more readily available, it shouldn't affect resale value ideally.
Yeah, I mean, you can turn them off. So you definitely would want to leave your home without the default going out to your landscape if new people come in. But I would think it would be a benefit because some people want this. A lot of people do. So if they move in somewhere that already has it, that would be a benefit.
Absolutely. Great. Let's see. Speaking of kind of gray water systems in households, have you seen any research that kind of shows how many households are currently using gray water systems?
That would be a great thing to know. So the only number that we have is very old, but it's probably still, good enough. It at least gets you in the ballpark. It was a study done by the soap and detergent industry. So they sent a really large mailer out all across the country, like, I don't know, tens of thousands. Like it was quite big. And they asked people what they were using the water for. They asked them about gray water, other things. And so that soap and detergent industry study is the only thing that we use to estimate state level numbers. That's how I got that number of unpermitted systems in Oregon, because that came before there was even a way to get a legal system. So you can extrapolate, they tell you percent user per state. And that study is linked to on our website if you're interested. But again, it's very rough.
Makes sense. Is dishwasher water considered gray water in Oregon?
I think it is considered gray water, but I don't think you're allowed to use it. But I actually can't remember. So sorry, I should look that one up.
No worries. When you're doing those mulch basins, will any wood chips work, or do they need to be a hardwood?
Any wood chips would work. The bigger the chip and the harder it is, the longer it will last. Because over time, especially when you're adding moisture, these wood chips will decompose. And once they've decomposed, they'll turn into this really nice organic matter that you're adding into your landscape, but they won't filter as well and they won't infiltrate as quickly. So once a year, you'll check on your basin. If you look down and you see soil and not wood chips, then you need to remove that soil and add fresh wood chips. Some people use very fine chips, and that happens much quicker than bigger or harder wood chips. So it's just a maintenance question. If you don't mind maintaining your system more frequently, you can use very thin material that breaks down quickly. But if you want to prolong the maintenance, then use bigger, chunkier wood chips.
Makes sense. So this person has a solar salt system that back flushes and the water has no salt taste. Is that bad?
I don't know. I would suspect the company could tell you the levels of salt. We did, and then to find out, is this a okay quality, I could point you to a study that Greywater Action did several years ago, where we tested gray water and we sent it to an irrigation lab for irrigation compatibility testing. And so in our study, if you get into like the appendices, you'll see the various levels of salt. Salt's called different things. There's different types of salt levels, and whether that's suitable for long-term irrigation or questionable or hazardous. And so if you go into our study, if they give you a number and you're like, what does this mean? You can go into our study or Google it, or you could send me an email.
And I have a question that I can answer. So the question was asking about the Tualatin SWCD. So Tualatin SWCD is a conservation district that's based in Washington County in Oregon. So we provide resources such as education programs like this to help implement conservation actions within our community. So more information can be found on our website that should open up at the end of this webinar here. Let me just check the chat to make sure we don't have any other questions. Looks like we do have one. So if you have a condensation pump from a high efficiency furnace or tankless water heater, can this be used as gray water to water plants as well?
Condensation water is, I don't know if it's classified with gray water or not, but it is a non-potable supply. At the residential level, I think it's probably not very much water, but I would guess yes, as long as it's not contacting some kind of metal or something that's leaching, or maybe just check into it a little bit. But typically condensation, like air conditioning condensate, all of that is totally good for irrigation.
And I'm sure the state coordinator can probably answer those very specific questions. And I'll include a link to the state of Oregon Greywater page that you had up earlier in that follow-up email. So, and I know that page does have the coordinator's contact information on it. So let's see. Another question just came in. How do they find out how much area they can irrigate with gray water if they're just using a shower and laundry water?
So there are in my book and in the manual, though the manual, the free download one is a little bit off because it's a different climate. But there's like really rough rule of thumb numbers. Like I'll just tell you it. It's excuse me, every square foot of planted area needs about a half a gallon per week. So if your tree, if you look at like the shadow, let's say it's a hedgerow and it covers 20 square feet, that hedgerow needs about 10 gallons per week. So that's pretty rough. There's ways to get more accurate based on the type of plant and your climate. You're using your evapotranspiration rates but in your climate. There's some online tools, there's a calculation, there's ways to do it. It's not too complicated, but there is like one equation, or you need to, if you're in California, there's an online app that's just great. It's called puddlestompers.com and there's an app called How Much Water, and you just pick from the drop down your city, there's tons, and say, what is it, a high water or low water use plant, and how big is it? And it gives you a number. So, and there's actually some Oregon cities in there too. Actually, I forgot the woman made that for us.
And I know there is actually a resource from the Regional Water Providers Consortium called a weekly water number that is very similar to that as well. So I'll include a link to that in the follow-up email for those folks who are asking. I know that's based in the Portland area, but I want to say it also offers zip codes that are throughout Oregon. So that might be another resource to explore. Well, I think that is the last question that we have for this evening. So I want to thank you so much again, Laura. It was great to see this presentation, and thank you for your time and all your knowledge. It was really wonderful to hear about these types of systems.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.